welcome to this enhanced podcast from Enlightening Science, the outreach wing of the Newton Project at Sussex University. We're dedicated to providing resources to help improve the understanding of Isaac Newton, his importance to both his own time and ours, his influence and his thought. I'm with Alexi Baker of Oxford University. Alexi is an expert on the 18th century trade in scientific instruments in London, and she's going to be talking about the instruments, their makers, and their role in the experimental lectures which flourished in the 18th century. The intellectual and the entrepreneurial collide. In this, the third part of her talk on experimental lecturing in the 18th century, Alexi discusses the instrument makers themselves and the various ways in which they supplemented their incomes.
We've now seen how the instrument trade was spread across London during the 18th century and how it provided tools for a wide variety of people and pursuits. Lecturing entered this multifaceted and often profitable equation from both the intellectual and the commercial angles. On the purely intellectual side, instrument makers sold their wares to many dedicated lecturers and sometimes participated in related advertising and publishing, or moonlighted as lecturers themselves because of a personal interest in the subject. On the more commercial side, many instrument makers chose to contribute to lecturing because of the potential profit to be found in selling related goods or in advertising their instruments in the course of speaking and writing. This potential could be increased by public interest in specific astronomical events, by the genteel fashion for natural philosophy, and even by the early modern appetite for public spectacle. For most people, the obvious connection between lecturing and instrument making is that they served individuals and institutions that had an intellectual commitment to Newtonianism. A small percentage of instrument makers even gave talks themselves because they had long been interested in the subject. This is perhaps clearest in the case of Francis Hauksbee. Hauksbee was originally a Colchester draper, a dealer in cloth or clothing and dry goods. But by the early 18th century, he shifted to making and selling air pumps, pneumatic engines, and even surgical equipment at a shop in central London. In 1703, at the first Royal Society meeting helmed by President Isaac Newton, he conducted the first in a long series of experiments related to phenomena such as the vacuum and electrostatics. Hauksbee essentially became the Royal Society's dedicated experimenter for its weekly meetings, although he never received much financial compensation for the job, and he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1705. His writings appeared frequently in the Philosophical Transactions and were later collected in a popular volume. It's evident that Isaac Newton himself must have guided the instrument maker in his research on the same sorts of phenomena which Newton was investigating, including magnetism, light, and the behavior of electricity. Hauksbee also gave lectures at his shop, which echoed his performances at the Royal Society, and which he advertised in the newspapers almost continuously until his death in early 1713. At the beginning of his lecturing career, he presented with James Hodgson, and towards the end of it he worked with William Whiston, the well-known astronomer who had been dismissed from Cambridge for religious heresy. This allowed Hauksbee's Newtonian observations and related inventions to reach an even wider audience than that which he had at the Society. The instrument maker invented demonstrational tools, which were especially visual in nature. Attendees of his private and public performances could suddenly see the effects of subtle natural phenomena quite clearly. For example, in the vivid light created by static electricity when he rubbed material over a rotating glass sphere. The instrument maker's reach was further extended by the beautifully illustrated catalogs for his public lectures, which were sold by the author and by other trade members, including the opticians Edmund Culpeper and John Marshall. Provincial lecturers began using, and in some cases selling, this text as well, either purchasing copies of it from Hauksbee or having their local engravers duplicate the copperplate images. Craftsmen in the provinces and abroad sometimes used the depictions as patterns for their work. The same use was made of the illustrations from other popular Newtonian texts, for example the books of Desaguliers, in the case of the local craftsmen who contributed to Portugal's first university collections. Yet despite the degree of learning and interest to be found in some instrument makers like Hauksbee, the trade often intersected with lecturing for far more commercial reasons. Trade members who gave lectures and published books could see their instrument sales rise due to these activities, since both revolved around the devices to a great extent. Other trade members picked up on this potential benefit and incorporated lecturing and publishing into their overall commercial strategies. Benjamin Martin and George Adams, for example, both based successful businesses on this trifecta of activities. It's highly likely that other instrument makers and sellers also turned their hand to occasional lecturing during the 18th century when it seemed a good financial bet. Most were relatively flexible in this way, building portfolios of different activities and types of stock, which would hopefully bring them success and stability. Lecturing would have seemed an especially promising prospect shortly before predicted astronomical events, including eclipses, the return of Halley's Comet in the 1750s, and the transit of Venus in the following decade. These usually led to a flurry of related talks and publications, and even to the itinerant sale of relevant instruments, such as eclipse glasses. The instrument maker and author Benjamin Martin even built a large mechanical model of the transit of Venus of 1769 for the lecture room of his shop. You can see a reconstruction of it in this photograph. A clockwork mechanism moved a representation of the sun down a slot in a pastoral backdrop towards the horizon, while a gear train moved a dark dot representing Venus across the face of the sun. This showed Londoners how the transit should look from the fields north of the city, and also helped to draw customers to Martin's lectures and encourage them to purchase his related goods. Such multitasking was important when the majority of individuals involved in any early modern trade needed to secure a living before they could indulge in other interests, such as the teachings of Newton.
This enhanced podcast has been an Enlightening Science production from the University of Sussex. The sound recordist was Lucy Cook. It was edited by Lucy Cook and Pete Langman. The producer was Pete Langman.